3 months ago, my 6-year-old daughter and I were sleeping in a crowded women's shelter. Not visiting, not volunteering, living there. Have you ever tried explaining to a child why their life suddenly fits into 2 duffel bags? Every night I'd climb onto the top bunk while Sophie curled up below me with her stuffed rabbit, Daisy. The shelter lights never fully turned off. There was always a buzzing fluorescent glow, footsteps in the hallway, quiet crying behind thin walls. And every morning, Sophie would ask the same question in that small, hopeful voice. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Mommy, when do we go back to our real home? I never had a good answer. My name is Lena Morales. I'm 29 years old. And at the time, I was working as a medical receptionist, making just under $17 an hour. Not exactly the kind of paycheck that keeps up when rent in your city suddenly jumps by $800 overnight. So when our landlord raised the price, I tried everything. Extra shifts, borrowing money, even asking my parents for help. They told me the same thing every time. We wish we could help, Lena, but we don't have anything. I believed them. Completely. Then one afternoon, while Sophie and I were standing outside the shelter waiting for the dinner bell, a long black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb. An elderly woman stepped out. Silver hair, perfect posture, expensive coat. She looked straight at me and asked a question that made absolutely no sense. "Why aren't you at your house?" I stared at her. "What house?" The woman frowned like I had just said the sky was green. And that's when I realized something strange. The woman standing in front of me was my grandmother. And according to her, I wasn't supposed to be homeless at all. But the part that made my stomach drop, 3 days later, when my parents heard what she said, they both went completely pale. What kind of grandmother drives up to a homeless shelter and casually asks why you're not living in the house she thinks you own? Because that's exactly what happened. At first, I thought my grandmother Margaret Whitmore was joking. I hadn't seen her in almost 9 years, and the last family gathering we attended together ended in one of those messy arguments that people pretend never happened afterward. So seeing her suddenly standing outside a shelter felt surreal. Oh, but before I explain that moment, you need to understand what life looked like for Sophie and me back then. The shelter ran on strict rules. Dinner at 5, lights out at 9. You signed in and out like you were checking into a motel every night. 30 women and kids shared 2 bathrooms. Some families stayed for weeks. Some stayed for months. Sophie tried to treat it like an adventure. Kids are strange that way. She made friends with another girl who liked drawing unicorns, and they'd sit on the hallway floor coloring while the adults whispered about jobs, rent, and court dates. But sometimes Sophie would ask questions that hit like a punch to the chest. "Mommy, when we get our house again, can Daisy have her own bed too?" Daisy was her stuffed rabbit. I'd smile and say, "Oh, of course," even though I had no idea when that day would come. Then that black Lincoln pulled up, the kind of car you don't usually see parked outside a homeless shelter. The driver's door opened slowly, and out stepped a woman in her 70s with perfectly styled silver hair and a navy coat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Margaret Whitmore, my grandmother. She spotted Sophie first. Her face softened immediately. "Sophie?" she said, surprised. "My goodness, look how tall you are." Sophie hid behind my leg. She barely remembered her. Margaret walked closer, smiling warmly, then looked at me. And that's when the confusion hit her. Her eyes moved from me to the shelter building, back to me again. "Lena," she said slowly, "why are you here?" I gave a small, awkward laugh. "Well, we're staying here for now." But Margaret wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyebrows pulled together like something wasn't adding up. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Why aren't you at your house on Cedar Ridge?" For a second, I honestly thought she had mistaken me for someone else. "My what?" I asked. "Your house," she repeated calmly. "The one your grandfather left you." The air around me felt suddenly heavy. I shook my head. "There must be some mistake. I don't own a house." Margaret's expression shifted. Confusion turned into something sharper. She studied my face carefully. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. That house was transferred into your name 5 years ago. 5 years, but according to my parents, no such house had ever existed. And that's when my grandmother slowly reached into her purse and said words that would unravel my entire life. Then we need to talk about what your parents did. How do you accidentally forget that someone owns a house? That was the question spinning through my head the entire drive to my grandmother's place that evening. Margaret insisted Sophie and I come with her right away. No arguments, no delays. She spoke with the kind of calm authority that made it clear this wasn't a casual family visit. Something was wrong. Her house sat in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from the shelter, the kind of place where lawns are trimmed perfectly and nobody expects a homeless mother and child to step out of a luxury car. Inside, Margaret made Sophie hot chocolate and gave her a puzzle at the kitchen table. Then she motioned for me to sit across from her. Without saying a word, she walked to a cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Old papers, carefully organized. "Lena," she said, sliding the folder toward me, "I need you to read something." At first, the documents didn't make sense. Legal stamps, property forms, signatures. Then I saw it. Property address, 214 Cedar Ridge Lane. Owner, Lena Morales. My name, my full legal name. The transfer date was 5 years earlier. My hands actually started shaking as I flipped through the pages. This can't be real," I said quietly. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "It's very real," she replied. "Your grandfather insisted on it before he passed. My grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, had died when I was 24. I remembered the funeral. I remembered the grief. But I didn't remember anything about inheriting a house," Margaret explained slowly. "Your grandfather owned that Cedar Ridge property for decades, a small 2-bedroom house, nothing fancy but fully paid off, and before he died he made a very specific request. He wanted that house to go to me, not my parents, me. He believed you were responsible," Margaret said. "He thought you'd hold on to it instead of selling it." I stared at the documents again. Every page said the same thing. Owner, Lena Morales. "But I never signed anything," I whispered. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes," she said. "You did." She tapped one page with her finger. "Your parents handled the paperwork for you." Suddenly, memories started resurfacing. A holiday dinner. My dad handing me a few forms. "Just routine estate paperwork," he had said. I signed them without thinking. Margaret watched my expression change, then she quietly reached for her phone. "I think it's time we ask your parents a question." She dialed the number and pressed speaker. The call connected. My father answered. Margaret's voice stayed calm, controlled. "David," she said, "why is Lena homeless if she owns the Cedar Ridge house?" Silence. Not the normal kind of pause. The kind of silence where you can practically hear someone's brain scrambling. Then my father spoke, but his voice sounded completely different. Nervous. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply repeated the question. And the moment she did, I heard something I had never heard from my father in my entire life. Panic. What could make two parents panic when someone asks about a house their daughter supposedly owns? That question kept echoing in my head all night. I barely slept. Sophie curled up next to me in the guest room at Margaret's house, completely unaware that something huge had just cracked open in our family. Meanwhile, I stared at the ceiling, replaying that phone call over and over again. In my father's voice, tight, nervous, like someone who had just been caught. The next morning, Margaret didn't waste any time. "We're going to talk to them," she said, direct, simple. An hour later, we were pulling into my parents' driveway, the same house I grew up in, same white siding, same porch swing my mom loved, but something about the place felt different that morning, heavier. Sophie stayed in the car with Margaret, coloring quietly while I walked up to the door. When my mom opened it, she looked like she hadn't slept either. "Lena, what's going on?" she asked. We stepped inside. My dad was already sitting at the dining table, hands clasped together like he'd been waiting for a difficult meeting. Then Margaret walked in behind me and placed the folder of documents directly on the table. No small talk, no easing into the conversation. "Explain," she said. My dad stared at the papers. My mom looked at him. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, my dad sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Okay," he said quietly. "It's not what you think." "Have you ever noticed people say that right before telling you exactly what you think?" He started explaining. 5 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, the Cedar Ridge house was legally transferred into my name. That part was true, but the house needed repairs. According to my dad, it needed plumbing work, roof repairs, and new flooring before anyone could live there. So he suggested something: a temporary management agreement. I remembered it immediately. A few pages he asked me to sign during Thanksgiving dinner. He said it would allow him to handle the property logistics. I was 24, trusting, busy with work. I signed. What I didn't realize was what that document actually allowed. My father looked down at the table before finishing the sentence. "It allowed us to rent the house out." The words landed like a brick. "Rent it?" I asked. My mom jumped in quickly. It was just supposed to help cover repair costs. But then Margaret asked the question no one else had asked yet. "How much rent?" My father hesitated. Then he said the number. "About $1,850 a month." My brain did the math before I could stop it. 5 years, over 60 months. That meant while I was struggling to pay rent, while Sophie and I bounced between apartments, while we eventually ended up in a shelter, my parents had been collecting income from a house that legally belonged to me. Margaret folded her arms. "So where did the money go?" My father didn't answer. He just looked at my mother. And the silence that followed was worse than any explanation. Because in that moment, I realized the truth was about to get even worse. So where did the money go? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud. My father stared at the table. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, nobody said anything. Then Margaret spoke. "We're getting a lawyer." No debate, no family negotiation, just a decision. Within 48 hours, a property attorney was reviewing every document connected to the Cedar Ridge house: lease agreements, bank transfers, rental contracts, 5 years of records. And what those records revealed was something I still struggle to wrap my head around. For 5 years, the house had been rented to different tenants. Average monthly rent, about $1,850. Total collected over that time, just over $110,000. Money from a property that legally belonged to me. None of it had gone to me. Some of it went toward my parents' credit card debt, and some toward home renovations in their own house, and a portion of it even funded 2 family vacations I had been told they could barely afford. Meanwhile, Sophie and I had been struggling to survive. The lawyer acted quickly. The management agreement my father had me sign was legally weak, especially once the ownership transfer was verified. Control of the property returned to me. The current tenants finished their lease and moved out peacefully a couple of months later. Margaret helped me hire contractors to fix the small repairs that had supposedly been the reason I couldn't live there. And then, 3 months later, something surreal happened. Sophie and I pulled up to Cedar Ridge Lane, our house, a small 2-bedroom place with a maple tree in the front yard and a squeaky screen door. Sophie ran inside the moment I unlocked it. Her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. Then she shouted from the hallway, "Mommy, we have stairs!" I laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. Standing there in the living room, I kept thinking about that day outside the shelter. If my grandmother hadn't pulled up in that black car, if she hadn't asked that one simple question, I might never have known the house existed at all. Sometimes the biggest secrets in a family aren't hidden by strangers. They're hidden by the people you trust the most. So let me ask you something. If you discovered your parents had kept something like this from you for years, what would you do? Would you forgive them? Or would that trust be gone forever? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more real stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, make sure you subscribe.